We're out here at the old 1992 Chevy Camaro, and I'm going to be changing the fuel injectors on the 3.1 liter V6. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to be doing a new thermostat because you got a lot better access to it with the intake off. So I'm also going to be pulling the upper intake manifold. Some people also call that the plenum. I just call it the upper intake manifold. Anyway, I drained the coolant out. It's over there. You also might want to do that even if you're not changing the thermostat, because the throttle body links up to the coolant right there. So to take the throttle body off, you have to undo those coolant lines. If you're just doing injectors, you could probably get away with just leaving the throttle body in its location there, but I decided to take it all the way off. Anyways, other things, you have your intake pipe that runs across. It's over there. You need to remove that. That's just hose clamped on, some 8mm or 5/16 or a screwdriver. You need to remove your EGR tube. You don't have to remove the valve, which goes there. I just have that off because I was fixing it. Your EGR tube just bolts on with two 10mm bolts right there. They can be a little bit tricky to get a socket on, so you might need a wrench. And that comes off. You can leave it attached on the other side, and it won't be in the way. The throttle body's got 2 bolts on it, as well as 2 connectors, and this vacuum line. Those all just simply unplug. Your upper intake has 5 10mm bolts on this side, and then 3 on this side, and then it has 2, well, mine had 2 of these studs. They were 13mm. I was able to just place a regular 13mm socket on it, and then had just enough to get the ratchet just barely in, so you might want to consider a deep well for that. After that, if you're removing the throttle body, you have to unclip the throttle cable. That just clips. There's a clip that you have to remove. I guess you would have cruise control hooked up to that if you have cruise control. I pulled the bolt out of here. I don't know what that bracket goes to just yet. And then you also have to undo some vacuum lines from the rear. Those just pull off. And I elected to, we'll take a look at the throttle body. I decided to take these clamps, move them up, rather than take these clamps on the front of the throttle body and move them down. This must be some sort of air heater that they have on there. I'm gonna have to look up if you even need that. I might just delete that. And once you undo all that stuff, your upper intake will come off. 2 things to note: you are going to want to clean this up and avoid getting anything down these holes, because that'll go into your engine. So I'm going to shove either some rags or paper towels or something down there to make sure that stuff doesn't get down there. And the other thing to note, the throttle body was stuck to the intake. Once I removed the bolts, it would not come off. And then the upper intake was stuck to the lower intake. It would not come off. I was in the engine bay trying to lift up on them and it wouldn't come off. So I took a rag and a hammer and put the rag on the throttle body, tapped it, came right off. Put the rag on the intake, gave it some taps going down on the front of it and then going sideways, and broke it loose. Okay, talking about the thermostat, I placed the upper intake back on there to check. I'm now convinced you could actually do this without taking the throttle body or the intake off, but taking them off would just make it a bit easier. You've got a bolt there that you can access from the top. Your EGR line would get in the way a little bit, but you should still be able to access it either with an extension or a swivel. And then the other bolt over in there, you should be able to actually get to that with a regular wrench, but with the intake off you can get it right from the top. With the intake on, actually with the intake on and a swivel, you might be able to get to it. But anyways, then I do believe you would have just enough clearance to sneak this out past the intake on the throttle body if it was on. And then you would find your thermostat there. Here's the old one. I did have to stick a screwdriver in here and pry a little bit because it was stuck. Gonna be replacing it with a new 195 thermostat. The old one was 195, this new one's 195. And I got a new gasket and a new gasket for the thermostat itself. It didn't actually have the gasket on the housing, but I'm going to put one on. And you're going to want to go and clean it up the best you can with a scraper or a screwdriver, and then clean this up too, and then put it back in. There it is, back in place with the rubber gasket. I'll show you what this just goes back on. And you can see with the intake off from above, you've got good access to that bolt there. So it just makes it a little bit easier. But if you were just changing your thermostat, I think it is actually possible with the intake on, and that'll save you headache of taking it off and changing the gaskets. So now just put the bolts back in. I'm going to put the seal in, put the bolts in, and it'll be good to go. Also, I did not, some people always suggest drilling a little hole in your thermostat. I did not do that. That's more for if your engine has trouble bleeding air out. This engine really shouldn't have that trouble. Update: if you're just doing a thermostat, do not remove the throttle body or the upper intake. Scraping those gaskets off was terrible. Those paper gaskets get crushed by, I guess, enough force that they become like a solid piece of plastic almost, and it was like they are super glued to the intake aluminum. So what I ended up doing, I soaked them overnight in WD-40. That didn't seem to help. What did seem to help was rubbing alcohol, and then you basically just have to sit there with a razor blade and rubbing alcohol and keep dabbing them down with the rubbing alcohol and just scrape them off with a razor blade. And it was a pain in the ass. And then I went and cheated on the other half, the top half. I used a wire wheel on a 4.5-inch angle grinder. That got the job done quite a lot easier, but you can damage the aluminum with that. So use caution if you do decide to do that. I'm not recommending you do that. The razor blade worked okay. And I'm especially recommending you don't use the wire wheel on this half, because you'll get aluminum shavings down into the intake, and that can end up in your engine. The upper half I now need to clean out really well, so I'm going to be cleaning the inside of that really well. And it's also the same thing on the throttle body. You've got the same sort of paper gasket that attaches itself and will not come off. Anyway, onto the fuel injectors. You've got a little 10mm bolt over here on the back side that you need to remove, and then down in here there's a little 13mm nut that has to come off, and then you can unplug them, and then you have a vacuum line, and then you have a 10mm bolt here and a 10mm bolt that I removed from back down in there. And now you're ready to pull off your fuel rail. I should mention that here is the pressure test valve, and you can press that down with a little screwdriver, or I used a little bolt to bleed the system. You can probably should put a rag or a paper towel over that before you press it, because it will spray. This car's been sitting for like 2 weeks and it did still spray. So you can bleed the system off before you start, and then when you pull up the fuel rail, there shouldn't be as much that sprays out. I should mention I removed the throttle cable bracket. There's just one more 10mm bolt. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea to take an air gun and try to blow this out down in there before you remove the fuel rail, because those holes lead into the engine, and as you can see, they get kind of dirty. I cleaned it up with some Q-tips, making sure not to get debris down in the engine. I also chopped the zip tie that was holding that random wire to the fuel line, and then you can pull it out. It is a little bit stubborn, but that's the seals holding on. You lift it up and it comes out. Your flexible fuel lines will let you move it over here, where you will have some rags and towels set up. I pulled out the first injector, and this thing is full of fuel, so I dumped it into this Arizona Mucho Mango can. You don't have to dump it into a Mucho Mango can, but that's what I dumped it into. It's not a whole lot, but it's good to pour it out into something instead of on yourself or on your car or on the floor. Anyway, removing these injectors, down in here you have, let me show you one that's got better light. You have a little clip. There's a long part here, and you can see a clippy part there. What you have to do is sort of pry on the long part here to rotate it. And anyway, looking at this one, you can see it will rotate on there. And once you rotate it enough, it comes out. That clip locks it into your fuel rail. So once you rotate it, you can pull it out. Make sure that the rubber gasket has come with it, and then and then you can unplug your fuel injector and put the new ones onto your fuel rail. You do have to transfer the clip to your new injector, so just match it up the way it came off, and then you want to put a little bit of Vaseline on the O-ring just to make it slide in easier, and then your new injector goes in. I'm going to need 2 hands to do it. And then your plug, it only goes on one way. There's a little metal clip that you take off to get the plug off, put it back on, and put the clip back on. There's no polarity on these, but the plug has got a little groove on it showing you which way it goes on. Swapping these all over was actually probably the easiest part of this. I did break one clip and had to get a little pick out, and I was still able to rotate it from between the injector and the fuel rail. So now that they're all swapped and plugged in real nice, lubed up these O-rings, and I'm going to carefully place it back into the intake there. Once you've got the fuel rail bolted back down, it's a good time to check for leaks, and then bolt your throttle cable bracket back down, get the vacuum lines rerouted, hook that one back up, and then you can slap your upper intake back on. I'm going to smear some Vaseline on the aluminum and maybe on the gaskets as well to try to prevent those from sticking, just in case I ever have to take this off again, because that was a huge headache trying to get the old gaskets off. So just to be preventative, I'm going to slap some Vaseline on and bolt everything back up. If you drain the coolant, remember to put the coolant back in. Remember to hook up all your vacuum lines. Three on the back, one on the throttle body. Plug everything in. You should be set.